Hey, Chapel here, and today we're talking about the builds of Crown Prince, like what you should be doing on this character to always be doing enough damage. And I'm going to be looking at every single weapon in the game and saying how well I think it performs, like how reliable it is, and how I think you should go about each one to make it work. So, starting off here, just want to get to the kind of biggest fundamental behind playing this character, which is elemental fusions. So the important ones are the damage fusions. So you've got Miasma and Combustion. So Miasma is a combination of Decay and Shock. Decay, importantly, this is the one that you get from throwing your smoke grenades, a base part of Crown Prince's kit. So unlike any other character, you do not need one of the most important elements for getting elemental fusions. The grenades have an 100% chance of applying this, so using a shock or burning weapon, fire or lightning, you can immediately apply elemental fusions easier than any other character in the game, which is the main reason why Crown Prince is so much more reliable in the higher difficulties. And so yeah, to start off, Miasma damage. It is a damage over time effect that's based off max HP, and it can stack up. And once this gets to max stacks on a normal enemy, it pretty much one-shots them. So I've got some notes here on it. All that matters is how quickly you can apply it. So that means with rate of fire increases, just like high projectile or high rate of fire weapons, anything that can apply it quick makes Miasma a lot better. And yeah, same with if it's got the higher elemental chance, that means you can just apply it quicker. And like I say, stronger versus normal enemies, it does, I believe, 20% max HP per stack if it's a normal enemy. But that's greatly reduced on elites and bosses. In the early game, I'm talking about kind of first couple acts, it still gets through bosses and elites very, very quickly. You can use this in the first act and the desert to easily shred through any boss, any elite, and have no problem at all. But the later into the game you get, Miasma's going to start struggling more and more, and going into the Act 3 elites, it'll start slowing down your damage a bit. If you get against Serpent as your boss on Act 3, that's a pretty tricky time for Miasma, because it's pretty hard to keep the stats up and keep the damage over time going for the whole fight. And into Act 4, it only gets worse, because once again, the elites have a lot of health. The final boss, Pole Monarch, he doesn't die particularly quick to Miasma. And there's also the UFOs, which are an enemy that is completely immune to Miasma. And if you are only running Miasma as your fusion, then these things can take multiple minutes to kill at the moment, with if you don't have the weapon damage to back it up. So Miasma used to be a much more viable strategy in high reincarnation without needing to rely on combustion at all, but it has fallen off a bit. You can still go solo Miasma, but I will touch on that in a little bit as to why it's not really a good idea anyway. But next move on to Combustion. So Combustion is the combination of Decay and Burning. And yeah, once again, this is just from your grenades and a fire weapon. You can achieve this very easily at any point in the game. And rather than the damage over time, this is an AoE burst of damage. Each time it procs, it gives you a multiplicative buff of the amount of weapon damage you deal, and it'll do it in an AoE around the target. This basically means that the later into the game you get, this scales up more and more, and it combines with any scrolls, any ascensions, any weapon upgrades, any inscriptions, anything like that. This just stacks up the combustion damage more and more and more. So it is weaker in the early game. It's still good damage. It's still good damage in the early game. If you want to run Combustion as your damage, it can work. Miasma does do it better, but you can still run fire weapons early on and do enough damage. But once again, it gets better with elemental chance. More combustion procs does just give you a lot more damage. The only downside of it, it can struggle versus the bigger health bars when you don't have enough of those like different pieces of damage yet. Like enemies that come to mind, sort of sharks in Act 3, they usually have really big health pools that can be a problem to kill with combustion alone, but Miasma does it very easily. In Desert, there is the bandits that charge at you. They are very awkward to crit because their crit spot is in the back. That doesn't matter for Miasma. They kills them very quickly, but Combustion Build does not have an easy time. Also, the Arsonists in Stage 2 are a bit slow because they have blue shields, so the decay and fire damage both do reduce to blue health. And yeah, that's just a tricky enemy to kill in general. That's a very easy one for Miasma once again. But the more weapon damage buffs you get, this will keep scaling and will inevitably get better than Miasma in the late game if you high roll enough and get the things you need. Finally, talk about manipulation. So this is less important than the other two, but it's still very powerful. It's a combination of shock and burning, and it is a crowd control causing normal enemies to attack each other. And you really shouldn't die to any normal enemies. If you're able to apply this quick enough, then they all just become a non-factor, because you kill them before they even get the chance to attack you, because they go under the manipulation effect. They no longer even pay attention to you. They attack each other, and you don't have anything to worry about. So as long as you don't mess up on elites and bosses with manipulation, the normal rooms become much, much easier. So that brings us on to like the actual like builds you should go for achieving these elemental fusions. And first of all, this is the most bog standard generic Crown Prince build you can ever do. It's just triple element. So this is using Miasma, Combustion, and Manipulation. You get all three of the fusions. And to achieve this, you just have to get a Gemini inscription on 2 weapons, one being lightning and one being fire. So grenades will be your source of decay, and your weapon will apply both the lightning and fire. So using your weapon alone will apply the manipulation for the crowd control, and then with the grenade in effect, you'll be applying the Miasma and Combustion as well. So you will not be doing damage until you throw a grenade on the target. And the thing that's so good about this, you can take whatever ascensions you want, you can take whatever blessings you want. It is just a flexible build, because all that matters is that you're able to apply these elemental effects. So from there, you can kind of like take it whatever direction you want. And the sort of, if you want to know some generically good choices for taking ascension-wise on Crown Prince, Hex Smoke, very solid, just a debuff on enemies that makes them take increased damage and deal less damage. Like it's just a very like sort of overloaded ascension to do all those things in one go. It's giving you both defense and damage at the same time, basically. You don't have to bring it past 1 point. Hex Smoke's very good at rank 1. You can max it out if you want. It makes the debuff a bit better, and at rank 3 the debuff is 20 seconds long, so you don't have to manage it quite as much. But I personally like keeping Hex Smoke rank 1. And the other one, Elemental Rage, once again, just good in any build. If you're applying elements, it is just a flat-out damage boost. Like, you can't really go wrong with it, and whatever direction your build goes, it will still give you a good buff. So it's, yeah, just a solid choice once again. And for blessings, I mean, Elemental Maestro is just broken. It is a really, really ridiculous. Like, the fact it's giving an 100% damage boost to your elements, as well as making them guaranteed. Like, if you want an easy start for an easy run, then Elemental Maestro is just the way to go in this build. And secondly, we'll talk about a bit more of a specific one, which is the Combustion Build. So this is the build that combines elemental effects, but also getting high weapon damage to try and, like, hit hard that way as well, rather than just using the elements alone as you would in the triple element build. This is just the combustion fusion, so it does need some punch to back it up. And to go alongside this, it's a bit more complicated with the Geminis as well. So you've got a few options which can be quite situational. So first of all, you have the shared damage of fire/no element. Like if you pick up an element, I mean if you pick up a weapon that has no element at all, you have to do this first option to be doing good damage in this build. You need to share it with a fire weapon, that ideally being Piercing Flame or Fire Tower, as they are the two with the highest fire proc chance, with Piercing Flame being 40%, Fire Tower being 50%. And if you combine a fire weapon and another fire weapon, then you can even get to 100% proc chance on your combustions. So this can be a very powerful way. It is a huge damage increase when the enemies are stood in the grenade, because you will be proccing combustion basically every time. The other alternative is to share damage fire and corrosive. So this means you're able to apply the combustion without having to worry about grenades. Like, this usually isn't as good as double fire share, but there are some situations where if an enemy is hard to reach a grenade on, then it can be alright, but the only time that's super relevant is UFOs. UFOs are really hard to get the grenade hit with, because usually they are just too far in the air to be able to put grenades on. So it's better for that, but most situations, fire plus fire is a better share. And the third situation is, this is mostly exclusive to a fire damage sniper build. So if you have a Piercing Flame, or you've picked up a sniper rifle that already has the fire element on it, then you can run a crit weapon as your secondary instead. So if you're running like a sniper as your secondary weapon, like they have the highest crit chance, the highest crit X's on them. So you want to share it with Strikewing is the main one. Strikewing has the highest crit in the game. So share your fire damage sniper with a Strikewing for high crit. And that it can be another option aside from the double fire, because it means you have less proc chance on your combustion, but when you do proc and you get a crit, you can hit a lot harder. And for this one, Ascensions are more important. Ascensions and Blessings are both like more specific than they are in the triple element one. This is a sort of less generic, do whatever you want kind of build. If you have these hard-hitting weapons, then getting Energy Blade is a really big way of getting like the huge damage boost. Like the single hits just start hitting really, really hard. It basically gives you Lei Lao's primary skill as your orb. Like orb becomes a very similar kind of skill to that, because it just becomes throw it out, fire a big shot, and you can nuke everything in the area. And you want to always make sure the enemies have corrosive on them beforehand as well, to be getting that combustion proc, or you will not do anywhere near as much damage with the Energy Blade. And it makes sense, because you are just relying on this one fusion. You want to get rank 3 of Pyro Dominance, because it doubles the effectiveness of your combustion procs, and even just your burning procs. Even when you don't have the corrosive applied as well, the burning just starts hitting hard by itself. And finally, blessings. Elemental Maestro, once again, is just always the good blessing. It just, you can't go wrong with that. But with this Combustion build, another option, which is a bit more of a niche to play around, it's like quite a different playstyle, it's the Craftsman's Inheritor. So this pretty much means you want to try and take a weapon before first boss. You don't want to pick up a weapon any later than first boss that you hold for the rest of the run. Because even if the inscriptions aren't as good as like some of the late game weapons, the amount of weapon upgrades can make up for it, because you can upgrade it right from the start, and it's easily going to be getting into the plus 30s, plus 40s even, by the end of the run. And with this kind of build, just having a hard-hitting, like, big damage number weapon is more important than, like, some random inscriptions that's got on it. So the only thing you need to pay attention to compared to normal, you can only have 20 scrolls. So you do need to get good at identifying what's useful and what's not. And you need to just drop anything that's, like, not really contributing much in, like, the current point in the run. And one more thing worth noting about Craftsman's Inheritor, be very careful about taking curses anymore, because unlike normally where you can just grab a bunch of curses and see if you get some good stuff from it, curses just actively take up your slots. So you want to avoid them more than normal. But yeah, anyway, that's it for the builds, and now we'll move on to all of the weapons and doing reviews of how to make each one of those work. Okay, so now moving on to all of the weapons in the game, and yes, this looks like a tier list. No, it is not a tier list. My take on tier lists in this game, they're not a good way of reviewing the weapons or scrolls or anything else. It's like, it's not really how it works, and people can be incredibly biased based on what things they've had good runs with. And I'm gonna do my best here to kind of organize the weapons on how I would rate them. So I will kind of say if I think a weapon's stronger than others, I will kind of say about that. But I'm not objectively saying these are the good weapons, these are the bad weapons. It's just a case of how likely are these to work. Because yeah, like a lot of people, they think weapons are bad just because they have never had a run where they've made that weapon work. And also, I think this kind of thing is very character dependent as well. Some characters benefit a lot more from different weapons compared to others. And if you were to do a tier list for weapons on any different character, it would look completely different based on which one you're doing. So yeah, I think if you wanna look at how good weapons are in this game, tier list is the wrong way to see it. I don't recommend that kind of thing. But anyway, just to explain some of these then, so always strong. These are weapons that any build, like any setup, any inscriptions, they will just be good. They will always do good damage, no matter what, just because of, like, they are the way they are. And there are a couple Crown Prince weapons that stand out in this category where it just doesn't matter what sort of roll you get on them and what sort of build you're doing. Below that, always viable. So these are weapons that you technically always can use, but they can be a bit underwhelming unless you have a build to back it up, or if it's the right point in the game for it. Like some weapons are good at certain points and not at others, and they need to kind of like have some time to get the ball rolling. We got good with no reload setup. So I'm talking here about things like Advanced Depot is the main one. but also if you have combos like Against the Flow with Genesis, or just Against the Flow with Big Enough Mag, basically just any setup where you're no longer having to reload your weapon. And there are a few weapons in the game which, like, most weapons gain a bit of a DPS increase from not having to reload anymore. There are a few, you'll probably be able to guess one or two of them if you've played many runs with that kind of thing. But yeah, there are some which get tons more DPS to the point where they're just immediately broken from not having to reload. Good with Elemental Weave. So this is a bit of a niche category. Like, a lot of people don't really like playing this way. It's a lot more like difficult. It's you gotta kind of manage a lot more and press a lot more buttons than normal. So if you like a more lazy play style, then you can pretty much ignore the weapons in this category. But yeah, it's a Scroll Elemental Weave, which guarantees elemental effects when you swap weapons. And it pretty much means, yeah, there are a few weapons that are really easy for swapping between, which make them a lot better when they have this scroll. And most weapons, because of the amount they need to reload, they don't combo as well with this. It makes them very clunky to use. But yeah, there are a few I'll mention which fit into this category. These next two tiers, these are for the weapons that aren't elemental by default, but can become viable as soon as they get an elemental effect rolled on them. And the ones that are strong with elemental inscription, there are some which are just much higher damage weapons in most situations compared to the ones that are just that I just rate as viable in my experience. The situational tier, I'll sort of talk about those on a case-by-case basis. They're usually quite niche in terms of needing certain inscriptions or something along those lines for them to be kind of easy enough to use. And finally, hard to use. So they're still weapons you can win runs with, but the ones in here are just making it harder on yourself compared to any of the ones in these other lists. It's a case of there are just better options in every run compared to these weapons most of the time. And there aren't that many things that are going to go in here. Like, most of the weapons in the game are perfectly viable on Crown Prince, because the elemental effect principle that he works off just makes it that he can kind of play what he likes for the most part. But anyway, starting out, we've got the Angelic Aura. So this is a fast-firing, very fast-firing submachine gun, which does not have an elemental effect on it by default. And for this, it fits very well into the triple element build, if it's rolled with an element. Its actual damage by itself is okay, but you probably wouldn't want to do combustion on it compared to just doing a triple element. It is very, very easy. I don't think it's good enough to call it like, it's close to being strong, I'd say. Like, this is a good weapon, and other characters, you could possibly even say it's their favorite. It's very close to being one of the best bunny weapons, but we'll leave that for another video. And on this character, it still works very well because of its high fire rate. It procs Miasma very, very quickly. You can stack it up really quick, so it makes sense for this to be ran in a triple element build with high rate of fire. So things like Wildfire as the inscription, this will benefit a ton of. The high rate of fire will be stacked up massively from that kind of thing as well. So yeah, Wildfire and any kind of like Miasma based stuff going on with that is good. And Argus next. I'd say pretty similar with this. I'd say probably slightly worse than the Angelic Aura. You probably want to be running triple element with this as well. The damage on it is quite high though. You could probably also get away with doing combustion on it. If you roll a fire one, share it with a fire tower, or the piercing flame. This with combustion procs, yeah, would also hit pretty hard. So once again, it's an alright weapon. If you get Elemental Inscription, then sure, you can run it. Next, we've got Aura Venom. So this is one of the good with no reload setup weapons. So the right click, very, very fast fire rate when you do that. And the main downside of this, it is a corrosive weapon by default. That cuts triple element from being possible, unless you have one of the scrolls like the Ring of Fire or the Ring of Lightning. But from there, you can share this either with the with a fire weapon or with it works with both Miasma and Combustion. So it's sort of up to you. Like you kind of you'll be covering weaknesses either way. Like you're gonna be weak to certain things if you just do Miasma. You're gonna be weak to certain things if you just do Combustion. Like this thing becomes a lot better if you do get a lightning ball inscription on it or a fireball inscription. Then you can still do triple element, which is ideal. But by default, being corrosive is a big weakness of Aura Venom. But in a no reload setup where you can do the right click, that sort of carries this a lot and makes up for the fact that it shares the same elemental effect as a grenade. Next is Big Hippo. Honestly, overall, I'm not a fan of this weapon at all. The fact it's a heavyweight weapon. It really cuts your move speed. Crown Prince is already the slowest character in the game. And this just makes it even harder. So once you do have enough move speed, then it becomes a bit better. But you also ideally want to have triple element with this, so you want to roll it with lightning or fire. And even then, it is a case of something like the Angelic Aura will just do the same job better. Like that, you could maybe make an argument for viable with an elemental inscription, because it is viable. It's just, it's not as good as the other options, and I'm not a fan of this thing. Like the slow wind up, the slow move speed, you can use it if you want, but it isn't as smooth to use as our other weapons. You may as well pick something else. Next is Bloody Drill. So this is our first sniper rifle we're going into. And I'm going to put it as strong with Elemental Inscription, because this is one of the best snipers, arguably the best. Between this and Strikewing are probably the two main contenders for being the strongest sniper rifles in the game. Rolling this thing with a fire inscription is a big deal. So if you roll it with no element, but it's good in other ways, you can share it with fire, and you could play it like that with the Energy Blade build, Combustion Build. But ideally you want to roll it with fire, and then you can combine it with crit, or share it with more fire for the higher proc chance. But yeah, this thing, the fact you will have the fire procs along with the bleed, which deals damage through the shields and armor of enemies, it makes a lot of the enemies are usually quite annoying. They just become a lot more trivial because of the bleed. Some big examples being Arsonist and the snipers in Desert. Both of those die very, very quickly suddenly because the bleed will just kill them through their shields and armor. But yeah, it's just a very good weapon in general. Bleed's good, and with rank 3 pyro, with massive burning, like, it just hits hard. Next we got Bone Dragon. So this is definitely one that I think goes into hard to use. So if you were going to try and make this work, I'd probably say just going into a combustion build is probably the way to go. The main things that explosive weapons have going for them, they actually do benefit off skill damage as well as weapon damage. So you could maybe find runs where you can make this kind of thing work if you've got enough skill damage. If you share it with Fire Tower, go into Combustion Build, you might be able to make this hit hard enough. But typically, the AoE explosive weapons, they just don't do enough damage on bosses, and that's a pretty big hurdle to overcome. Like, you can get through them eventually, but you'll just be in those fights for a really long time. So, yeah, once again, I'll talk about this later. There's also just a straight up better option than something like the Bone Dragon. Next, going into the Cavalry here. This thing is sort of between strong and viable. I think it's a little better than the Angelic Aura and the Argus. The main trait of this compared to the others, it's able to crit enemies without critting. So it fires in bursts, and the third shot, if you've hit the others, then you will get a crit on the third. So rolling this with sort of certain crit inscriptions, or rolling it as fire, it becomes viable for it to be shared with crit, instead of being shared as double fire or something like that. It's also perfectly good in triple element. Like, the rate of fire is okay. It's not quite as high as some of its counterparts. But yeah, it's quite flexible in that sense. It's fine for triple element. It's fine for kind of combustion and crit share. There's like quite a few ways to make this work. Like I say, it's very close for me to wanting to put it in strong, because it is a good weapon. And yeah, it's a lot of ways to make that work. Next, the concealed ammo. So this thing was better before, but both because of difficulty scaling and because of the direct nerfs it got to the right click, it doesn't really, like, I've not been able to get it working like as well as it used to, because the right click on concealed ammo, it used to be the hardest hitting thing in the game by quite a margin, especially if you shared it with crit and had a way to like cheat the crits. Then this thing could hit like an absolute truck. But it has been nerfed, but it's an interesting weapon because it fires fast, so it can be used for triple element. However, because of how hard the right click on it hits, it also makes it good with Energy Blade. So yeah, having a fire version of this is good. I think once again, you could probably make it work in Combustion Build, and you can definitely make it work for triple element. And unlike the other submachine guns, you can actually use it with Energy Blade. That is like the main thing going on with concealed ammo, but is a lot more fun. When it could previously hit harder, this thing was ridiculous. It's now just it's an alright weapon. It works. It's not like the God build weapon anymore, but it's still solid. Next we've got Crimson Firescale. This is one of the always strong weapons. Fun fact, this is my most used weapon in the game. I've got something like just under 800 hours now, and across that time, Crimson Firescale, because it's good, it's really good on Crown Prince, it's one of its best weapons. It's also just good on multiple characters, since it just does so much damage with the right click. I think it's been nerfed already, but even despite that, it still hits incredibly hard, and it's just a solid weapon for any situation in the game, just because of the amount of single target it deals. And because it's fire by default with a pretty okay elemental chance as well, this will always just be a good weapon on Crown Prince. You can't really go wrong with it, and most of the time the fire weapons in the early game are harder to make work than the lightning ones, but Firescale hits hard enough for that to not matter. And once again, you can roll any inscriptions on this, it's completely fine. So yeah, good weapon all around on that. Next up, the Demonlore. So this is everyone's favourite no reload setup weapon. This is like the kind of typical speedrun god build weapon. It is very, very easy to get the god build on any character in the game. All you need is a no reload setup, and that already hits hard enough. It wouldn't have to have an element on it, and this just hits hard enough to win runs. But the fact it's fire as well, Crown Prince can, yeah, make use of it even more than normal. Like, you can just about run it, even without a no reload setup. It's just about viable. It's weaker than other, like, weapons that have an element by default without the reload setup. But as soon as you get an advanced depot or against the flow setup on this, then you're just laughing. You've already got more than enough damage to win the run. Next up is the concealed ammo. So this one, I can't actually say I've used it enough. I'm not too confident on my opinion for this one. So there's a part of me that wants to put it into hard to use, but I can't see it being that bad. I think it's better than that. I think it's just viable. Like, you should be able to make this work in the Combustion build with Energy Blade. It doesn't hit quite as hard as some of the better snipers. Like, that's the main thing that lets it down. It doesn't hit quite as hard as the other snipers, but it doesn't hit fast enough for you to justify wanting to do it with triple element. Like, it doesn't really benefit off of lightning share much. So I think you do just want to double fire share this, or have it as fire with crit share, and you should be able to kill stuff. But seeing the same thing of a like bloody drill or one of the other snipers will probably work out better most of the time. Next up we have the Dragonchaser. So this one, I think, once again, it sort of teeters on between strong and viable. I think it's maybe slightly worse than the Cavalry. But it's got a very similar deal going on with it. This is a assault rifle themed around kind of critting because of its mark. So the right click, it marks anywhere on an enemy, and the bullets will always track to that one point. So this is 100% a single target weapon, which, funnily enough, makes it very good with a bit of a different kind of Crown Prince build. If you want to run orb build, which I think the Ascension is called Aftershock, it converts your orb damage to the current damage type of your weapon. If you get a fire damage Dragonchaser, then the orb is able to handle the AoE damage with grenade plus orb will just like nuke a pack of enemies, and then the Dragonchaser with its mark is very, very good for killing a single target enemy, because you can run this thing with crit, you can run this thing with triple element because of its fast fire rate, and you can also run it with like double fire share. I'd typically say it's between crit share and triple element if you roll it as fire. If you roll it as lightning, you're kind of forced to fire share into triple element. But yeah, it's a good weapon, and it's very fun to use. One more thing as well about this, it is one of the biggest wing god counters in the game. A lot of people find that boss annoying. Dragonchaser has no problem at all. You mark its head, and you're headshotting for the whole fight, and it's very easy. It tends to die quite quick, especially, like, say, if you're running an elemental one. If you've got Miasma or Combustion procs on Wing God, and you're headshotting the whole fight, it really doesn't last very long. Okay, next we've got the Duel Fang. So this is a unique weapon in the sense it's the only thing that can be a triple element weapon without grenades. So you can share this with a lightning weapon, ideally the Flowing Light, which has 50% shock chance. And it now gives you triple element without the need for grenades. The only trouble with this, it fires fast, but it's got like a bit of a wind up on it, and it doesn't hit hard at all. It doesn't scale very well with weapon upgrades, which means it is mostly relying on the Miasma damage rather than the combustion procs. And in the late game, this thing does fall off compared to other weapons. Like, it's very, very good kind of mid-game in Desert. Like, makes it so easy, the fact that you're just applying triple element without the need for grenades. But it's just not that good overall. I think it can be carried a bit by, if it gets inscriptions increase its elemental chance, then yeah, it can make it work a lot better early on. But your damage will typically fall off a bit with this, but it's still good enough to win the run, and that's all you need ultimately. You're just not often going to have kind of god builds with this one. Oh, also, one inscription as well. If you get element spread to all enemies, that's also works very well. I mean, that's a good Crown Prince one in general, but Duel Fang especially, with it dealing 2 potentially 3 elemental effects at once, it works really well with. So next up, the Fire Dragon is certainly a situational weapon. So this is an interesting one to talk about because it is one of the strongest early game weapons in the game. Like, it is insane against all of Act 1, aside it falls off a bit on the boss, and then from there it only gets more and more tricky to make this work, because it is a fire weapon by default that doesn't hit particularly hard. It's just got a really high fire rate, and most importantly, it pierces. And that is why it's so good Act 1. Because things like horse heads, like elite horse heads as well, they are a massive pain. Like, a lot of people understandably say those are some really annoying enemies, and Fire Dragon just deals with them so easily. And honestly, any enemies in Act 1 are not a problem for this thing to kill. The hardest thing in the game to deal with in Act 1 with this weapon is the Elite Spearman. But because of Crown Prince's grenades, you still have a good way to deal damage to him. You just need to, yeah, make sure to not be greedy, just make sure to kite it properly, and yeah, this weapon will do fine against that as well. So the only problem is making it last into late game. So it's got the other problem as well, it's lack of range. So you need to have a good enough defensive setups to be able to like get into range of stuff. And yeah, you need to get it kind of triple element to be able to apply Miasma as well, for this to have a way of dealing damage. So you can make it work into late game. Ideally stick it to an early game weapon, but if you want to try it till the end of the run, get Miasma working on it. And yeah, it won't do the job as well as other things typically, but you can make it work. Next up, the next two are both melee weapons. So the thing with Fire Tower is an interesting one. It's it's somewhere between always strong and situational, because this thing, it did just get nerfed in 1.0. It still always does good damage, not quite as much as before, but it does good damage. The fact it's melee is the only thing holding it back. The right click, that's still a thing. You've still got a ranged ability on the right click. And this thing is insane with the double fire share Gemini. This shared with another fire tower will be 100% combustion chance on every single swing. So yeah, with enough weapon damage buffs along with that, this thing it hits hard. And in lower difficulties especially, this can quite literally just kind of one-shot bosses with the energy blade and such. It falls off a tiny bit in higher difficulties, but that's mostly just because of you need more defense to make this work. That's the only reason I think it's situational. Like, it does enough damage. You just need to be able to survive. Like, melee weapons are harder to use. They're tricky on certain bosses. And yeah, you just need to fight. If you get something really broken, if you get Spirit Feline, like something like that, where you just know you'll suddenly be safe, then sure, take Fire Tower. It's very easy. As soon as you find a way to survive, this weapon's fine. You just need to do that. Like, it'll do enough damage. You just need to live. And it's a similar story for the Fire Tower. Like, this thing, you don't have the option of doing double fire share. It's lightning by default. So this is a weapon you go triple element on, because it hits hard. You don't want to do anything other than sharing with fire on this weapon. You just want to share it with fire every time, because you want to get combustion procs with how hard it hits. Interesting thing with this, with Energy Blade, the right click, it procs on every single hit of the right click. So if you run this with Energy Blade, which you do want to do, by the way, you want to run this with an Energy Blade build, then yeah, make sure to use your proc of Energy Blade on the right click to do max damage. And yeah, same story as the Fire Tower. It'll do enough damage for you. You just need to survive. And yeah, that's all you got to know about Flowing Light. Next up, Foundry. Straight up, hard to use. Foundry only is a category for the speedruns and stuff. It's a fun challenge to do. It's not good though. If you want to make it better, it copies the weapon level of your most upgraded weapon. So you can make it hit harder by doing that. But at the end of the day, this is the starting weapon for a reason. It's a mediocre revolver thing that that doesn't have an element, so it will never be able to benefit off the main things Crown Prince does. If you do want to try Foundry only, I personally think the easiest way to make it work is going like full on grenade ascensions and trying it that way. But yeah, you are actively making it harder for yourself compared to basically any other weapon in the game will do a bit better than Foundry, especially as you go later into the run. Like Foundry's fine for stage 1, but the later you get, the more and more this thing starts feeling weak. And speaking of weak weapons, we've also got Frenzied Shark. This is a very difficult one to pull off. And once again, it's good in early game. It's strong against horse heads. It can kill them through shield. And even without an element, it can just kind of get you through the first stage doing AoE damage, explosions. You can bounce the shots, meaning you can hit stuff behind cover. Like, it's got a lot going for it. It just doesn't scale well. And it's in this weird halfway point where it doesn't hit hard enough to really justify it being good on Combustion Build. But at the same time, it doesn't fire fast enough for you to want to run it with triple element. So it's an awkward spot. I'm not really sure what to do with it. I've not tried using it that many times into the late game. Every time I have, it's been pretty disappointing. I think the elemental version of this only has a 10% proc chance by default, which isn't very good for something that fires this slow. And it's the same story for a lot of the launchers, actually. They just don't have very good elemental chances, which holds them back a lot on this character. But yeah, Frenzied Shark, it's going to be a hard time trying to make this work compared to other stuff, but maybe you can try Combustion Build, maybe you can try triple element, but other things do the job better. So if you roll a good one, really good inscriptions, then sure, give it a go, but most of the time, other stuff will just... It's mostly going to be the bosses and elites Like, this will do fine against most normal enemies, especially if you're running some lightning with it. But on the Boston Elites, you'll really struggle to do enough single target, I think. Next is the Glimmering. So this is our first of the Elemental Weave weapons. So Glimmering, once again, it's a victim of being nerfed a huge amount. On release, this thing was the best weapon in the game. It's been gutted a lot to the point of being incredibly weak, where I think the only character who can arguably justify using this outside of the kind of Elemental Weave niche is probably the dog, but even then, that's at a push. Crown Prince can kind of use it in general, but it is best with the Elemental Weave. And this is simply because it is a no reload weapon by default. And it is very fast to swap to. And it's lightweight as well. You've got good move speed with it. Like, it's good in a lot of ways with Ellie Weave. But it is, once again, one of those weapons, because it doesn't hit that hard. It doesn't scale that well with the weapon buffs. And Elemental Weave in general, it gets worse after getting Geminis. The like swapping weapon Gemini is a complete joke. It's not worth taking. Same for Spores, which also works with weapon swap. They're just not good Geminis, and when shared element is a thing, you're basically doing the same thing as Weave without having to do the complicated weapon swapping. So Elemental Weave, it's typically a kind of early mid-game combo to get really good damage early on. But since you're not benefiting from Geminis much, it's trickier to work in the late game, but you still can keep running it. Your boss damage will be a bit lower because it's a build that centers a lot more on Miasma than Combustion usually. It'll fall off without the weapon upgrades. But yeah, the Glimmering fits into that well. It's fire weapon by default that's easy to swap to, and it's alright in stage 1 as well. In Act 1, it's worth mentioning. The explosion can hit horse heads, so it does pretty alright versus most enemies in general for stage 1. It falls off massively stage 2, as it has a horrible time dealing with Arsonists and the charging bandits. So yeah, at that point you do want to have other things to support this weapon, but for early game it can work fine. Next we've got our second sniper, which is a bit weaker than the Bloody Drill. I've not liked it as much since the change to it. It's close to being strong with Elemental Inscription. I think I'm going to put it at the top of viable though. So once again, it is just a weapon. You'll do either crit share or double fire with it if you rolled it as a fire golden bow. But yeah, with the Craftsman's Inheritor start, if you buff this thing a ton, it's going to do good damage. It'll be a good weapon. Like it can hit really, really hard. There have been things in the late game, any kind of sniper in the late game, if you stack it up enough, will be able to hit hard. And Golden Bow, with the like damage amp it gets from charging it as well, it can get some really strong, like big one hits. And when you get multiple points in Energy Blade and Pyro, yeah, this thing is one of the snipers that will benefit from that a lot, because it hits very hard in a single shot. And we've got another sniper up next. It's the Goshawk. If you saw my most recent video, you'll probably see why I've put this in situational, because that is how I've always thought of this weapon. If it wasn't for a single orange inscription it had, I would probably put it in hard to use, because it is just horribly clunky to use. But the inscription of auto-aim suddenly makes this very, very usable. So if you find it with auto-aim, then share it with fire, or if you find it with auto-aim and fire, then share it with crit or with more fire. And yeah, this thing's good with auto-aim. and if it gets enough weapon upgrades, it needs the weapon upgrades to be good as well. If you find it without that, it is, yeah, bordering on the hard to use. So I would recommend sticking to it with the automatically targets enemies' weaknesses inscription. If you don't find it with that, then use at your own discretion. I don't think it's very good. But it can still hit hard enough. It's just trickier to like kill stuff quickly with it. So I will definitely prefer it being situational rather than calling it like a viable one in general. Next up we've got the Hell. I think this one, once again, it's viable. It is very good with combustion mostly. It can work with triple element too. But this thing, its only drawback is the fact it's not got much range. You need to be close to kill stuff, but against elites especially, this thing hits really hard. And once again, scales with weapon upgrades really well. You can really get some good elite and boss damage with this. I think it's the normal enemies it has the hardest time with, because it's just anything that's really far away. It's going to be a lot trickier than normal to kill with this weapon, because you kind of have to get like mid-range to close range up in their face. But once you do get on top of stuff, if this is an elemental hell, it'll just blow it up immediately. It's also a piercing weapon, so it is good in the early game. It's worth picking up in the early game for the killing horse heads. The shield elite in Act 2, it kills very, very quickly as well. And if, once again, especially if it's an elemental one in the early game, this thing is a god weapon. It is insane if you pick this up early enough. But yeah, it'll scale very well as well. It just, yeah, you need to find ways to get in range. You probably need a bit more defense in your average weapon because of that. But it's not the worst weakness ever. It's pretty easy to get good runs with this gun. And speaking of good runs with this gun, next up we have the Illusion, which is easily strong with elemental inscription. This thing is god tier with fire or lightning. Like, it's perfectly good in triple element, in combustion, in any build. If it's an elemental illusion, this is just one of the hardest hitting weapons in the game already. So combining it with elemental effects just makes it almost overkill at that point. It's got better range than Hell as well. And the fact it's got better fire rate makes it better applying Miasma too. So you won't have a hard time at all. If you want to use this, then find it with an element, and that's your damage for the rest of the run. It barely even needs the weapon upgrades to hit hard enough to just kill bosses quick. But if it is massively upgraded, then bosses will melt, elites will melt, normal enemies will melt. It's not got much of a downside. It's like only slight downside. It's a single target weapon. You won't do as much AoE with it, but when you are killing everything immediately single target, that doesn't matter at all. And with Combustion Fusion, that's hitting for AoE damage anyway. So if stuff's close enough to each other, then that weakness is gone as well. So yeah, you won't have a hard time. Just pick up Illusion if it's elemental, and you've won the run probably. Next up, we've got Justice, another situational... I almost want to call it almost honestly, I think, because the only downside is it's boss and elite damage, but overall, I think it's not too bad. It's like, if you shoot it upwards, it's got a bit more range than the Fire Dragon. It's not got quite as much damage on single target, but it's not too bad. It hits harder, so it benefits off combustion a bit more. It doesn't go quite as well with Miasma. So it probably is best to run with Combustion Build, or actually, maybe with triple element as well, but the trouble is you're always going to have the issue of single target. Like, you're going to have some really hard times with something like a defensive robust shark is going to cause really big issues with this weapon. But with most things, it'll do fine. Like, it'll shred most normal enemies. You'll just have a long time on bosses. And also, this thing's, along with the Fire Dragon, it's one of the best early games. It's one of my highest use rates as well, alongside Firescale, because I pick these up a lot. It's been nerfed a lot as well. This thing used to be really strong. It would have been in always strong if it had been in its previous state, but it's been nerfed multiple times now. But yeah, still a good weapon. Like I say, it's borderline on situational just because of how bad the single target is now. But I think it just about, I think, works anytime if you want to make it work. Next up, we've got the fire gloves. So for these, they are pretty much always viable. The only thing I will say is, in early game, if you don't have Elemental Maestro, these things don't have enough elemental chance to actually, like, kill anything. It is almost worse than the Foundry. So don't pick these up early, but as soon as you've got Shared Gemini, then it becomes very good. And I'll talk about the other gloves later on, but as you'd expect, it's a pretty similar story. They're both very similar weapons. It's just the fire glove has an effect on it which is more catered towards single target rather than AoE. But yeah, let's move on to the next one, which is Lightning Blast, which is certainly just always viable. It is a lightning weapon with 20% shock chance, really good for just applying Miasma. Just a solid weapon going into triple element. Doesn't scale the best with weapon upgrades, so it does fall off a bit in the late game, but early mid game it's perfectly good, and it still scales well enough to work late. Like, I'm not sure if you'll always pass the DPS check on Pole Monarch with this, unless it's like massively upgraded or you've got tons of damage, but it's still not doing too badly for the most part. The right click's an interesting mechanic with the whole shooting through the field for extra damage. And I think as long as you don't find the slow shots too clunky, then yeah, you'll never have too much bad time with this. Just throw grenades, shoot, apply Miasma, easy typical lightning weapon stuff. Next up, we've got our one sniper, which is fire damage by default, meaning it's always viable. It can hit really hard with weapon upgrades. If you are running the what's it called, Craftsman's Inheritor, you can pretty much pick up any of these, and you can just start upgrading it from the get-go in order to get it to late game quite smoothly. And because it's 40% fire by default, you can often do share crit if you want to. There's not much of a downside of doing it, but if you wanted to do double fire, then you have like 90% if you're sharing it with a fire tower. If you roll something like double elemental chance, then it's 80% just by default, so you can easily share it with crit. Like this is a good Crown Prince. Like, this is like the bog standard Crown Prince sniper, full stop. Because yeah, you have combustion right from the get-go. You don't even need to wait for Geminis. You don't need to wait for a good inscription to be rolled on it. Just take it with Energy Blade. Your damage will be fine. And as the name suggests, it's piercing. Once again, piercing. Good versus shields. Good versus horsehead. Good early game weapon. This thing doesn't do the best versus first boss. That is like usually like it you need to have a lot of stuff going already with Energy Blade and stuff for this to not have a really sluggish time killing first boss. But outside of that, it's not great versus the arsonists or charging bandits once again in desert. But this thing will only get better as the run progresses. It scales very well with weapon upgrades, hits really hard, goes amazingly with Energy Blade, and it's just the easy go-to sniper if you want to play that build. Next up, we've got Poisonous Ghost. So I'ma just say this probably a hard to use. Like, I've not really experimented with this thing that much, but it is a melee weapon with corrosive by default, which is already two things that aren't good going on for it. So it can hit all right. It's got the right click, which does max health and can hit quite hard. I think if you run it with Combustion Build, then you can maybe make this work. Like, I couldn't see that being awful, but because you have the weakness of having to get in their face being a melee as well, I don't think it's as good as the others. But yeah, I'd say it's easier than any of these others, like maybe about the same as Hippo. I think it's easier than these two because, once again, the bosses can just be a pain with melee weapons. Playing against something like Serpent or Wing God just won't be fun, and because you've got this thing corrosive by default, it has to have the Gemini before it starts doing anything. Until that point, like, this weapon's just going to be useless, because its weapon damage by default on this character just isn't enough. Next we got the Porcupine, another corrosive by default. But I'm not really sure where to put this, because despite being corrosive by default, I think I just put it in situational, because it's not bad enough despite being corrosive to not be worth taking, because this thing applies corrosive incredibly quickly. So if you're not using your grenades, you can share this with Miasma. Is the most ideal. I think Combustion, you really need to get it stacked up if it's going to start like actually hitting hard enough to work with Combustion Build. But very early on, like if you get this shared with like a Flowing Light, this will just apply Miasma quickly and kill it that way. You can maybe do something like run it as Miasma in the early game and swap it to Combustion later on. But it doesn't do it as well as other weapons for Crown Prince, because being corrosive by default is just a big weakness. If on the other hand, this is like Lei Lao's equivalent of, this is his easy Miasma apply, because he applies lightning by default, so this is his kind of weapon. But Crown Prince is a different story. If you want to run it, you can, but other weapons just do it better. And we have a Prism here, which is another good with Elemental Weave. Not as good as the Glimmering, I'd say, because once again, it's corrosive. Crown Prince has his corrosive from grenades. You would typically do this as weaving with a lightning weapon, so you will be applying Miasma and just skipping out on fire if you do want to run the Glimmering. Because, like I say, weave builds typically aren't as good with just Combustion. I tend to prefer them just Miasma if you're going to do 2-element, but they fall off later in the game in general. But Prism, if you want to be less grenade reliant, it's an easy way for applying Miasma. And once again, it's a piercing weapon, so it makes it better versus shielded enemies. Just like the Glimmering, it was formerly the best weapon in the game at one point, or a lot of people would say so. When I first started playing, this was the best weapon for a good month or two at least. But yeah, it got its, I think, either the damage or the rate of fire cut. It just had its DPS reduced in general. But still a solid weapon in this scenario. Corrosive is a drawback, but it can work. You can, if you run one with, if you find one with a Lightning Ball inscription or Fireball inscription, this thing can be perfectly fine, and it can then go into triple element. That is actually a case I only just thought about, but that certainly makes it just good in general and can bring it into late game quite easily as well. Next up, Pupil. This is the best Crown Prince weapon in my opinion. It is insane. It is not bad at any point in the game. It is one of, if not the easiest thing to apply Miasma with. You just throw a grenade, shoot, and it's a 10% chance with 10 projectiles. So on average, you will apply 1 Miasma stack every shot. And yeah, that combined with the fact it just hits hard by default. So running this triple element, you just do so much damage. It makes runs so easy. You always have good damage. Doesn't matter what the inscriptions are. This weapon's busted on this character. It's a good weapon in general. And yeah, if you want to go to, if you're having a hard time dealing damage, just pick up any Pupil you see. It'll be fine. It is even better than Firescale. Firescale still has times where it can feel not underwhelming, but it doesn't feel like it's doing as much as you'd want it to. Pupil is like almost worth putting on a tier of its own, because this thing's just ridiculous. Next, Rainbow Arch. Very generic assault rifle. Aside from the right click. So the difference that makes, the right click is very hard hitting. So it's somewhat similar to concealed ammo in the sense that it makes it a lot better with Energy Blade. If you get combustion procs on the right click with an Energy Blade active as well, then you can basically run this as a mini sniper. It's not quite as hard hitting as most sniper shots, but it's fun to do regardless. And because it has that, it has the flexibility of, if it's rolled with an element, you can do triple element, or you can go into Energy Blade build. And yeah, it doesn't tend to do as much damage as other options, but it's more than good enough to work. So if you enjoy this weapon, if you like the right click, I certainly do. I've had some pretty cool weapons with this gun. Then feel free to have a go with it. Next is the Rainbow. I'm not really sure where to place this weapon right now. I've not tried it a huge amount in Reincarnation Ain't Much. I love this weapon on Tau. I've not found many elemental ones to use. I think it's basically just viable though. It's a very it's a good Miasma applier. I don't think it typically scales very well with weapon upgrades is its main drawback. Like, it's one of those things where it's massive rate of fire and then just doesn't stack up a huge amount. This thing can become very good with certain inscriptions though. There are some interesting things that can happen if you roll it with a 150% lucky shot of 3 crits, for example, and you're running a build with like a Fire Enthusiast, then Fire Enthusiast deadly counter, so it's always critting. There are some niche situations where this thing becomes very good. I almost do want to put it in situational, but I think it's just about good enough to call it just viable in general with elemental inscriptions, because it's just got a fast application rate of Miasma. The low actual power of it is the only thing holding it back. The fact it's like not the best with the upgrades, but regardless, it's a solid weapon and it's very good fun. The fact you don't have to aim is cool. It's not great against shield enemies either. You have to do a weird thing of you have to go right up in their face if they have a shield, and it can kind of shoot through the shield. But aside that, if you mark them, it'll still hit the shield. You just have to have to kind of weave around them a bit to get around that kind of thing. Next we've got the Scalpel. It's somewhere between the top of this or lower down in here. I'd probably say it's just strong in general with this is just a very high DPS weapon at the cost of ammo consumption. So it's got the changing the fire mode to double your ammo consumption, but it makes this thing's DPS like a lot better than your average SMG or assault rifle. It's pretty good in triple element. I think it's fine there. It could probably work in combustion, although I admittedly haven't tried that. So yeah, this thing, if you like it, worth giving a shot. Solid weapon. Go on to Scorching Rounds now. It's an always viable one. It's fire by default. Its main drawback, I never feel like it scales that well with the weapon buffs. It's never felt like that great in the late game. It's good with the, once again, it's a pistol, so it can roll the lightning ball or corrosive ball's inscription. So if you are running it, I don't think you typically want to do it with combustion only. I'd say run it with the triple element, and it should be able to scale fine late game most of the time. I've had one of the runs sort of early on into 1.0 where I failed the DPS check trying to run this late, but I think that was partly just because the build didn't have enough going in other areas. It's still, I think, a solid weapon. It's really good in the early game, actually. It does fine versus the first bosses, and it does pretty alright versus the normal enemies. The horse heads are a bit annoying because it doesn't have the piercing by default, but that's like the only thing at all that's even a slight struggle. You can still do walking up to them and baiting the shield swing and kill them easily that way. It drops off a bit in Act 2, same kind of enemies again with the Arsonist, the Charging Bandit, will make this a bit more of a struggle. But aside that, once it gets its Gemini, you should be fine. If you're starting to apply Miasma to stuff, then this will be good again. Shrieker. So this is one, I've heard a lot of people say really good things about this on other characters. I'm not too sure how to place this. Because I would want to put it in, like, there's part of me that even wants to put it in a hard to use. I don't think it's anywhere near that bad. But it's probably just like somewhere around here in viable, because this thing's a unique launcher in the sense it can actually benefit off crit as well. It can crit stuff. It has some pretty good inscription to support that as well. So if you get this with an element, and one of the, I think it's like hitting the weak spot guarantees a crit on the explosion as well. That's a really good inscription that can kind of carry this off the floor a bit. If you do want to play it, I'd recommend probably Combustion Build. This thing would scale off Energy Blade very well, and is incredibly slow to shoot, so you don't want to run it with Miasma at all. You just want to try and make the shots hit hard. The only bad thing is, enemies that it's hard to crit on, this thing's damage is basically similar to the other launchers, which is very mediocre, to say the least. So it's got its place. You can probably be fine with this, but I can't say I've tried it too much myself, so I'm not 100% confident on my opinion for this, but overall I think that's where I'll be happy with placing it. Next up, we've got our final good with Elemental Weave weapon. So this is the lightning weapon of the Elemental Weave builds. So Star Devourer, and unlike the other two, you are actively encouraged to weapon swap with this one. It reloads automatically when you're swapped away from it, and it's got higher fire rate when it's got a higher mag, more bullets in the mag. So you basically want to shoot it for a couple seconds, then swap to something else, and then swap back to it once it's fully reloaded in the background. So yeah, it's a case of it's a bit awkward to use, like if you're using it by itself. If you're using it with Elemental Weave, however, I think it's a really solid weapon, and this kind of build's worth giving a go if you've not tried it much. Star Devourer with one of the kunais, it's a solid combo. It'll fall off a bit in the late game, but everywhere aside from that, it's really, really good. And honestly, I need to try it out a bit more with how this does with like massive weapon upgrades. I can't see it being amazing, but who knows? It might actually be completely fine. And now that the like hard lose on the DPS check is gone, it really doesn't matter anywhere near as much as it did before. So I'm gonna have this used to be one of my most used weapons, but more recently I've kind of been playing a lot more with like Geminis and Elemental shares and kind of not use this as much. So I'll give it more a go, but it should be solid in general, and using it with Elemental Weave I don't think will ever be a bad combo. Next we've got Sting. So this is one, once again I'm not sure where to put it because it is a corrosive weapon, but I think it would work fine in Combustion. So I will put it next to Porcupine once again. It's probably a little worse than Porcupine, but I think you can run it with Combustion Build. The main thing it's got going, it's a hard counter to armored enemies. It just straight up removes armor on the explosive shot. So things like Charging Bandit, which are usually like really annoying, like you've heard me talk about that a lot for other weapons, suddenly become a non-factor against this thing. So it's good in that sense. If you find a way to do triple element with it, then sure, it becomes a lot better as well. For the most part though, you don't really want to be playing this when you can play other stuff. A lot of people say they find this clunky anyway, but yeah, you can share it with Flowing Light for early Miasma. You can share it with the Fire Tower for the Combustion. Those are probably the best ways of making it work, but yeah, it's a gun. It does something, but I'd say stick to the fire and lightning weapons for the most part, unless it's a weapon you really want to try and make it work. Next is the Strike Wing. This is another easily strong with Elemental Inscription. Fire damage Strike Wing, 30% fire proc by default. 30% is really good. That's one of the highest fire weapons outside of Piercing Flame and Fire Tower. So getting this with fire, then doing share crit is great. Doing this with double fire share. When you've got the energy blade hits, I've had one shots on third boss quite easily with this. I saw put clips of that before, and it's a very fun weapon in general with combustion builds. Sunder. This is somewhere around here and here. So this is, I think, just viable in general if you get an elemental one. If you get one as lightning or fire. And I think it just about scales well enough with weapon buffs to be fine in combustion build. But I'd say, the reason I kind of say situational, this thing is really, really good with the elemental ball inscriptions. If you get this with lightning or fireballs, corrosive balls aren't quite as good, but the orange inscription of lightning balls or fireballs on the Sunder is a very interesting combo, because the fact these shots split, each of those individual splits can headshot individually and have the 80% proc chance. It's a cool combo with this. But yeah, even if you because of the splits as well, it's actually got just a decent elemental proc chance in general. So I think it is just a viable gun, full stop. But I don't even know why I'm putting it that low. I think, now that I think about whenever I actually use this, I don't think I've ever had a hard time with this as an elemental gun. So I think the whole thing with the lightning and fireballs only makes it better. But I rate the Sunder. I think the fact it's a lightweight weapon as well, you're moving pretty quick with it. It's a good gun. Next is the Talisman. This is certainly situational. There was a point in time where I rated this a lot higher, but I think the higher the difficulties have got, this has fallen off big time. I'm putting it lower than that, actually. This is at the bottom of... This is borderline hard to use now. Even though this is literally just a Crown Prince weapon as well. It does not work as well on the other characters, but even for Crown Prince, it's a push using this. Its boss damage is pathetic. The tracking is a bit, like, funky on some of the fights. So it can be... It can be situational, though, in the sense that it has the one gimmick of it auto-tracks headshots. So if you roll it with a bunch of headshot inscriptions, most notably the ones, once again, of spawning fireballs or spawning lightning balls, they're really good. Or 150% lucky shot on 3 headshots in a row. Those are both inscriptions that can carry it. If you get both of those in one go, then it's arguably like an okay weapon at that point. The only trouble is its base DPS as a weapon is one of the most disappointing in the game. So that lets it down a bit. But the fact it can toggle between elements, it's flexible in that sense. But yeah, outside of using it as something to just prop Miasma on, it doesn't scale that well. You can find better options. But yeah, like I say, if you find it with crit inscriptions, you can run it into the late game quite easily as well. But that's the only situation where I would want to use this for that long. Next up, we've got Thunder Gloves. Very similar to the Fire Gloves. I'd say overall a bit better. The fact it hits in an AoE makes it so much better against normal enemies, because its application rate on stuff is just a lot higher. So the Fire Gloves do slightly better on bosses and elites for the most part. But the Lightning Gloves, yeah, just typically... And even then, and the more I think about it, you could even make a case for the Lightning Gloves being a similar level on bosses, because of the fact it is primary lightning. You get to share it with the high element as your secondary, meaning it'll have high fire chance and low lightning chance. More combustion procs on bosses is more important, whereas the Fire Gloves will have a small fire chance and a high lightning chance if you're doing triple element. So unless you're doing something like Elemental Maestro, where those elemental effects are guaranteed, you might wind up doing about the same amount of damage with the Lightning Gloves just because of the combustion procs that you get. Like, it's how many more combustion procs. If you're proccing 100% of the time on both, the Fire Gloves just hit harder because of the passive it's got of ramping damage on the same target, on single target. Because once this is fully stacked, this thing actually has really good DPS. But yeah, they are both very bad early game weapons outside of having Elemental Maestro, just because of how low their effect chances are and their weapon damages are laughable. So that's the only downside, but yeah, but both these things are fine. And yeah, Lightning Gloves, very easy Miasma applying if you have a 100% chance of Ele Maestro. Both of these get big buffs. Next, Lightning Blast, also always viable. It is a hard counter to Arsonists, which is a big deal, being one of the most annoying enemies in Desert. It used to even work against elites, making it a very nice gimmicky second weapon to have versus like the elite Arsonist and such, but that no longer works. But regardless of that, It's got 20% lightning chance, it applies Miasma fairly quick, the shield removal on right click is useful, it's a solid weapon, it's a pistol so it can be rolled with ball inscriptions, and yeah, I think that's all can kind of say about it. So it's a good gun. Tide Cannon, I'll say slightly better than Bone Dragon because it doesn't have the delay, but it's hard to use once again. The poor single target just lets it down. It does completely fine on like normal enemies, AoE, until you get against something like a shark and it takes a good few minutes to kill. And that's when these kind of builds really just have a hard time. They're just like not good launchers compared to other options. So yeah, you can maybe make it work with something like the Combustion Build, but it'll be a hard time compared to other stuff. Wild Hunt, our third good with no reload weapon. You ideally want to have an element on this as well. It's no element by default. If you get it with fire, this thing is insane. It is one of the easiest things to just immediately kill bosses with. A fire damage Wild Hunt with combustion procs and no reloads is a ungodly amount of DPS. It is a very janky weapon. If you're running it with no reloads, I really don't recommend playing this. It feels awkward to use, to say the very least. The whole like 2 shots and reloads, like you're usually killing stuff very slowly. Like if I roll an elemental one of this before getting a no reload setup, I usually just ignore it. I'll often try it for a bit, decide it feels clunky, and drop it again. Yeah, keep in mind for especially the Wild Hunt and the Aura Venom, you need very, very good ammo return in some way in order to make these work as well. Against the Flow is perfect if you're able to get it with a big mag size. But aside that, yeah, if you can deal with your ammo issues and you get an Elemental Wild Hunt, especially a fire one, then this weapon will do great. Next we've got the Woodpecker. This weapon's horrible on your hands, but it's good, it's viable, easily. Pretty flexible once again, it's high fire rate, hits hard, so fine for combustion, fine for triple element. You just have to click a lot, that's the only downside. It can roll some really good inscriptions too. It's really good with 25% chance to insta-kill normal enemies. It can roll the ball inscriptions, which I've talked about plenty already. They're just really good if you roll fire or lightning balls. Yeah, Woodpecker, if you don't mind the tons of clicking, then good weapon. Completely fine for all difficulties. Next up, we got the 2 new weapons to finish off. And you might see another one of the videos on my channel. So one with the most views is my one-shotting the DPS check with this weapon. It is strong. That's all I can say. Like, this thing scales insanely well with weapon upgrades. I think it's just a bit overtuned in general. Roll this thing with fire, and yeah, it just hits hard. Like, you can run this with triple element, because the left click's like a shotgun. It's like a shotgun and a launcher at the same time, which basically makes up for any weaknesses, because shotguns tend to be single target weapons, and the launchers tend to be AoE. And this thing just does both really well. If you're not running triple element with Miasma, I think it can struggle a tiny bit with things like the sharks, once again. Just really big health bars. But yeah, Mortar is a very hard-hitting weapon that, yeah, will be strong if you've got Elemental Inscription, and if you upgrade it a lot, then this thing, from what I've seen of it, just hits insanely hard. So yeah, it's a good one to be using. And The spear, on the other hand, I've not been impressed by. I don't think this thing's that good. It feels a bit awkward to use, and it just feels like it applies elemental effects just slower than other stuff. It's just a bit awkward. But I don't see any reason why it should be any lower than this. I still think it's got enough going for it to be fine with elemental effects. It just doesn't do anywhere near as much damage as other weapons that I've tried when they've been rolled as elemental. But hey, if you like it, if you really want to try it, I'd say triple element is probably the way to go. I'm not sure about running it with combustion. I don't think it hits hard enough. I think you'll have a really hard time with some of the enemies if you only run it with combustion. But triple element should be right. And with that, that is the full list done. So yeah, if there's any of these you'd want to talk about more, feel free to discuss. I'm very open to hearing about other people's experiences with these weapons and sort of trying new stuff. Like, I certainly don't think that my opinions are always right. Like, I sort of said, if I'm a bit shaky on if I don't think I've used a weapon enough, then I'm more than happy to be proven wrong on these. But regardless, I hope this has been helpful. I'll be putting out more guides going into next year, and hope you enjoyed. Have a good day, guys. I'll see ya.